So in my opinion, definitely easier. And that's going to sound weird because we're caught in a situation where there's kind of a dividing line between retro and modern games. And retro games seem really easy to preserve because we have all these ROMs, we have all these emulators. But all that took work. It took a lot of work to actually dump all those games and get them playable. And a lot of retro games still aren't playable the way that they originally were. They have sound issues, they have other issues. Like, we actually still haven't fully cracked the PlayStation in terms of emulation, even though we're like 98% there. There are still some titles that just do not run as well on an emulator. But as I said in another video, modern-day consoles are just kind of PCs. They're very specialized PCs, but they're PCs nonetheless. Like, a good 80 to 90% of console releases already have a PC release, and PC releases are very, very, very easy to preserve. It is a million times easier to emulate old PC operating systems than it is to emulate old console architecture. So that alone is going to end up making these games so much easier to preserve. And as far as console exclusives go, once again, they're basically just being run on PCs. So creating a quote-unquote emulator is actually not going to be that big of a problem. In fact, you pretty much won't need an emulator, you can just do code conversions. This is why we already have Yuzu, a Switch emulator, running. The Switch isn't doing anything super nifty with its architecture. It has some really interesting hardware and the Joy-Cons and stuff like that, but it too is basically a very tiny, weak PC. And so Yuzu doesn't have to do much. I'm not belittling the people who made it. There were still a lot of problems they had to solve, but like, they didn't face the same challenges of trying to get an emulator to run like an SNES or an N64. The fact that everything runs off of a hard drive now actually makes things very easy to dump. You don't need special dumping devices. You can just copy a hard drive whole cloth and the data's there, and all you need to do is wait for a firmware that can play it. DRM and remote shutdowns will be a problem, but there are many people who are already figuring out ways around that, who are coming up with new independent servers to play online games, so on and so forth. So yeah, I actually think that the quote-unquote death of the hard copy is good for game preservation. But actually that's not saying much, because the best thing that could happen for game preservation would be reworking our intellectual property laws so that library and preservation efforts were not blocked. But as long as we're working within these constraints, yeah, running a game off a hard drive means it's also easier to preserve it.